Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for sticking around, and thank you, Mahana, for the last panel. So we're here to talk about refreshing technology and the security implications of that. So one way that I thought would be good to begin as sort of a groundwork laying round robin is to ask you, Kevin, what is it, draw the connection for us between outdated systems and cybersecurity concerns at the DoD CIO's office? How do those two interrelate? And then, Austin, what does the Modernizing Government Technology Act do in terms of how does refreshing systems help cybersecurity? And then, Richard, tell us what we heard and tell us what you think of it.
Okay, we'll get started. So as introduced, I'm Kevin Kennedy. I'm over in OSD CIO, and in my portion of the portfolio, we work about command control, communication, computers, and information infrastructure capabilities, which is a really long job title. But what does that mean? We look about what does it mean in the cyberspace about how we execute our warfighting mission for the department. And when you're talking about the vulnerabilities, when most of the systems, the majority of our systems were fielded in an environment that's not the one we have today. And most of the modernization schedules for our weapon systems that we're going to execute execute our operations plans are on update rates that don't keep up with the pace of IT update rates. And when they were designed, it wasn't thought that we were going to have this active, contested fight for our information technology that are supporting these weapon systems. For example, the embedded IT systems or the platform IT systems that are on the platforms, we need to rethink how we update that at a rate that we can keep the systems viable and keep them secure. We are not going to be able to nuclear harden all of our systems in the department to that level, but there are some systems that we need to prioritize and look at and say, all right, which ones do we need to put more resources and effort, and which are some of the ones that we can accept a little more risk? We're not going to have to be risk avoidance across the department, across all capabilities, is unattainable. But what we need to do is figure out how do we do risk mitigation and how do we continuously monitor the risk that we are accepting and monitoring in our platforms to make sure that we can adapt and react to the things that our adversaries are doing. And really there's three aspects of that. The first is your basic cyber hygiene foundation, making sure that we're doing good practices. And the way we do that in the department right now is through a cybersecurity scorecard, which we're upgrading to a 2.0 version, which will be more automated, but that tracks 11 key things such as proper DMZs, proper operating systems, two-factor authentication, those sorts of things. The next level is modernization, system hardening, resilience. What can we do in that as we're fielding systems, or what we can do with the ones that are fielded and the ones in development. And finally, there's the active defense role of our cyber protection teams, and then how do we use machine learning and advances in AI to help us be more reactive and more supportive as we bring in. It's about the warfighting and the operations across the department.
Austin, what does your office want to do for them?
Yeah, so MGT, which I know the last panel talked about a little bit, part of what that does is gives agency CIOs, such as Kevin, the flexibility to take the funds that were otherwise set aside for those legacy systems and instead use that to migrate, whether that's to the cloud, to a different system, or the next best thing. A large part of that addresses the security concerns because, look, when you have systems that haven't been supported by the vendor in 10, 15 years, that's absolutely a security concern. And part of the problem is that agencies, under the current appropriations and budget cycle, don't have the flexibility to migrate those systems. So what we want to do is give you all the flexibility to make those changes, to secure those systems, and to modernize.
Yeah, picking up on these themes, I agree with both the gentlemen, and I'm pleased to see with VATARA in place and then an MGT Act that fixes the whole issue of how do you budget for modernization, right? And it's not just the funds at the central level, but it's also this notion of having working capital funds at the agency levels, which I think is a very positive thing. When I was at the IRS, I was lucky enough to be appropriated 3-year money in a working capital fund kind of model, and it gives you a lot more flexibility as an IT organization to plan properly. You're not caught in this vicious cycle of trying to obligate all these funds at year end, And it makes things a lot smoother, and you can be a lot more effective that way. So that goes to the heart, I think, on the budgeting side. On the security side, the general is right. It's not just modernization. You need to, I mean, certainly it starts with hygiene, good IT management practices and patch management, all those things that we need to do well. But there is something to be said for, we've got a lot of legacy systems out there. And frankly, CIOs, many of them are caught. They're trying to run these legacy systems. They're hard to migrate without any kind of additional funding. And they have some major security vulnerabilities. I go back to the OPM data breach as an example, right? With modern technologies today, you wouldn't expose millions of records, okay, through being able to access one system. And so if those systems credentials are compromised, all of a sudden you have somebody in there that can exfiltrate, literally millions of personnel records. That is just not a modern architecture. And it really put OPM at a true disadvantage. I mean, there may be some other issues. You could say, hey, they didn't manage that well, they could have done more. That may be all true, but the fact of the matter is, those people that were managing that and trying to inherit a lot of legacy systems on an old architecture. And that put them in a very vulnerable spot.
So Richard, and anyone else jump into this if you want to, how much of the cybersecurity concerns in government have to do with outdated infrastructure and outdated systems versus all of the other things we talk about, like cyber hygiene, like very pernicious adversaries, like not updating basic software?
I'll start. I don't want to put a percentage on it. You can't just modernize your systems and all of a sudden expect you're going to be secure, right? I mean, this is a constant battle against adversaries. Even this week, right, with this latest set of ransomware attacks, you've got to be diligent. That's both on the protective side and doing good IT management and good patch management, but also having the tools to be looking for where you have vulnerabilities and absolutely looking for where you have been breached, because it's going to happen. So you really do need a robust cybersecurity practice within the IT organization as you modernize. So you need to do both.
Yeah,
Kevin,
and
do you have thoughts
I'd
on that?
add to that. The only, if you think of it as a spectrum, on one side you got rogue actors, some capable adversaries, and then you have the nation state on the other side. Yes, some of the modernization, cyber hygiene, that helps on this side of the spectrum, but it's not going to get us all the way home. I agree with Richard that takes more of it. It's a contested, it's a competition, so we need to keep through across the whole domain.
And then Austin, the work, we talked about FITARA a little bit earlier, the work on modernizing government technology has gone back, at least in my mind, to late Bush administration, probably before my time, much earlier than that. How is MGT different, and what did you guys look at in determining this model?
Right. So I think if you look at MGT, a huge part of that is increasing agency CIO flexibility when it comes to that budget. So that couldn't be possible, or it would be much harder to be possible if it wasn't for FITARA and FITARA's implementation, which obviously, as many of y'all are familiar, increased the role of the agency CIOs to bring them up to the C-suite. And that was first started in Klinger-Cohen, which is even farther back. So I think the work that's been done before to build those authorities and those responsibilities is part of what's made MGT both possible and then hopefully, once it gets signed into law, effective.
Richard, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously a huge believer in both FITARA and the efficacy of that, as well as the MGT Act. I would say, in my experience, having worked in a couple of different civilian government agencies, the CIO definitely needs support at the agency head level as well as at OMB on the administration side. I think the good news here is we're getting bipartisan support from Congress, which is really positive, right? And that's putting some pressure on agencies more to really make these things happen. So I think there is a different sense right now than like when Klinger-Cohen passed a long time ago, that there's real support up in Congress to really make these changes so we can operate government more effectively with better IT. But it really does come down to that agency leadership. And I lived it, both sides, where I had a lot of support and where I didn't have nearly as much support in the CIO's office. And so you can see the difference. But if you can get agency leadership to really understand the importance of implementing IT effectively and what that takes, and leveraging the CIO to help make that happen, not as a, I want to be careful here, they need authorities, but you got to work collaboratively, right? You got to work collaboratively across the C-suite, as was discussed in the last panel, and you got to work collaboratively with the mission and business owners to actually get these things done. But there is something about that leadership coming from the top, empowering the CIO to make sure that we're doing IT and that we're doing cybersecurity well within the agency.
So just as a reminder, I'm going to be asking for audience questions relatively soon, so think of them, be prepared for them. All right. Speaking of agency leadership and responsibility, the executive order that came out in May, among other things, requires a responsible individual high up, whether it's the agency head or someone else, to be ultimately accountable for any cybersecurity lapses. Kevin, what's your office doing thus far to prepare for the executive order
So
implementation?
the first part is, I already mentioned it briefly, is a cybersecurity scorecard. So that is a tool that we're using to help kind of give a health awareness and to move behavior across the department. In the department, we want to align authority and responsibility as closely as we can. So the deputy secretary has talked to each of the services and the agency heads on specifically on where their service is or where their agency is on the implementation of those, to make sure that they understand and have a proper accountability. What we use is it's commander's business across the department. So the folks that execute the mission, the business owners, they need to be aware and understand the importance of compliance here, and that it's going to come home and it's going to impact our mission and our ability to do our warfighting mission.
So one element of the executive order is it requires agencies to use the NIST framework for cybersecurity that was originally developed for the private sector in some way to secure their systems. And it's not, there are probably numerous different ways of doing that, of turning one to the other. And NIST has a document out right now that I think closes for comments this week, sort of matching the cybersecurity framework to FISMA requirements that exist. Kevin, can you talk about the extent to which you guys use the framework, if you did at all, prior to this executive order, and how you're trying to match it now?
I can't talk too many specifics. Again, that's a different DCO, but I do know that we do leverage the NIST framework, the NIST practices, the best practices across as we're building our procedures in the department. I mean, there's no reason for us to invent our own procedures and policies if someone else has done the hard work and has tried different paths and has things that have shown that it work. We have a federated system but we need to have an enterprise approach, and it's got to be collaborative. We don't, the resourcing aligned with the authorities and the responsibilities is a challenge in DoD just because of the wide mission set. But we do have those practices in place to help in this area, especially in cybersecurity. And like I said, all the services, all the agencies are keenly focused on it.
Austin, has your office looked at the executive order and the work that's being done by these sort of new offices, the American Technology Council, et cetera, on security and modernization, and how that jives with what you're trying to do?
Yeah. So the Office of American Innovation, which was obviously recently stood up, has been a key point of what they're trying to do. I mean, part of one of their top goals is to be able to deliver better goods and services for the American people. And the way they see that, I think, I don't want to speak for them, but part of how they see that is through the modernization of government IT. So they've been extremely helpful. I mean, they were very interested in MGT. Chris Liddell and Reed Cordish actually put out a quote when it was introduced. Matt Lira over there, who was formerly with Leader McCarthy, has been one of the thought leaders when it comes to this. So that, coupled with the cyber executive order, which also stated that agency heads were going to be held responsible for the cybersecurity posture at their agency, I think those two initiatives combined should be helpful in sort of maintaining the role of the issue and the CIO within the agencies and across the government.
Richard, do you want to talk about what does it mean to hold an agency head or designated person responsible for cyber lapses?
Well, I'm with make this too complex, I really do believe, and I think the president has stated it directly, that he would hold agency heads responsible. So if you have a thing like an OPM data breach again, that you would expect that there be real accountability and up to them people losing their jobs, which I think in those kinds of cases, perhaps that should happen. I would want to make a point. I think I've been pleased with what I'm seeing as far as what's coming out of the White House. I think the cybersecurity executive order is very well written, by the way, and well thought out. A lot of activities to do, which is probably a hard thing for some of the agencies to actually step up to all these things, but directionally spot on. I would voice a concern about what I see in the administration, which is that we've just got still too many senior level positions unfilled. Right? We don't have a federal CIO. We don't have a federal CISO. We don't have all of the CIO positions filled, let alone some of the other senior leadership positions in the agencies, the political positions. And I think, for those that are career, that are in acting positions, I think they're doing well. But for them to really drive the agenda and make a lot of progress, you tend to find that doesn't happen. And I think the latest FITARA scorecard hearing that happened kind of validated that, right, where the score is kind of held pretty much constant. You might expect that to happen when you change an administration, but I think if we're going to start to continue to see the scores improve, you're going to have a lot more permanent people in these leadership roles.
Austin, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so FITARA scorecard, and thanks for bringing that up, has been a huge issue for Rep. Hurd in the IT subcommittee. I mean, I think part of that is keeping those issues at the forefront of the agency. So, like you said, when you're able to have that top-down leadership that addresses those concerns and is focused on that, I think that's always helpful. And in the latest scorecard, we've included, which didn't count towards the final score, but most likely will next time, megabyte implementation. So expanding that a little bit to try to keep building on those responsibilities and best practices.
Yeah, so agency leadership positions is one thing. Another thing is budget, and in the president's budget request, there were cuts in a number of, not so much in cyber operations, although, but in research and technology. Some of them at NIST, some of them at DHS Science and Technology. Do anyone here? Do you have concerns about the ability to modernize when you're losing some money?
So it was stated that way, of course, but I actually think the overall budget, if I got it right, and what I've read, and I don't have any inside knowledge here, just what I read in the papers as well, but overall the IT budget request in the president's budget actually was higher overall. That doesn't mean that certain agencies aren't cut. I think it's to me, having been the CIO a couple times in federal government, and this was talked about earlier, there's so much duplication, particularly in the federated organizations, the major departments of the administration. There's a lot there that can be saved. When I was at DHS, we were looking at, we were in at about a $6 billion IT budget. We thought we could save 10% of that by just working on the duplication issues at the IT infrastructure level. So that's $600 million right there. Now they've been chipping away at it, to their credit. I mean, they definitely have got some significant savings at DHS, but there's a lot more to be saved. So I think in many IT organizations today and agencies, it's not so much that you need a lot more money. What you need is the discipline. You need the leadership at the agency head level to start to really address these duplication issues, and to start to consolidate and start to modernize, move to cloud computing platforms rapidly, get out of that business of having to try to manage that infrastructure yourselves. There are organizations, companies that do it so much better than any government agency can, because that's what they do as their livelihood day in and day out, and rapidly modernize there. And I think then you can start to harvest those savings, use the MGT Act as a way to use those savings to reinvest, and then I think you start to get a virtuous cycle going.
What got in the? Oh, did you want to say something, Kevin?
It's actually for a large department, we have an example of that. Let's not cut hairs. So the defense travel system is a system that started. I was actually on the pilot. Started in the late '90s. It's a web-based way to do travel and to help with accountability. And over the years, it hasn't. The department has run it, but the commercial technology available and the commercial best practices have outpaced the system. And so right now, across the department, we're looking at a pilot, and then we're looking at a way to modernize that to get exactly the efficiencies out of the travel system and the efficiencies out of the management. So right now, DoD CIO is partnering with DCMO over in OSD and DoD to make sure to leave that out and to actually modernize that, and that's to get out some of the efficiencies that Richard's talking about outside of the MGT. We're moving forward on that.
So what are the roadblocks to doing that? When you're a CIO or a deputy CIO, you look at this, you see this can be modernized, I know exactly how to do it. What are the roadblocks to keep that from happening during the 2 to 4 to 6 years you stand in that position?
Well, I'll start. A couple of things that I found that make it difficult. One is the appropriations process and the way that budgeting works in the federal government, right? So in many instances, I was like CIO at DHS, the component organizations, and even at a program level, would be appropriated funds for their particular program. And you'd have this going on throughout DHS. So here's you are as a CIO trying to say, hey, we could modernize a lot of our IT infrastructure, have all you guys move to this new modern infrastructure. You can save money, and the department can save money, and we're going to be more secure, all these positive things. But they feel like they own, right? That's their funds. That's the way they've always managed. You got to break that cycle, and it's not easy to do. And I guess that leads to that point of culture, which is, a lot of these agencies grew up in this kind of environment where they got those funds, they controlled those funds, it was theirs. There's still a lot of that in the federal government. And so when you talk about shared services or you talk about consolidation and eliminating duplication and picking one thing and everybody moving to it, it kind of goes against that culture. And I'm not trying to say you can't have successes, because there certainly are a lot of them, but it's difficult. And I think that's been the issue since I've been in government IT, let's say the last 2 decades. You see this over and over and over again, and we have a lot of the same discussions. It's how do you break that culture so that you can get people to move and accept that, hey, moving to a common platform, doing it the same way, those kinds of things is actually goodness for all, even though in the very short term, it can be painful, right? I mean, transition is always painful, and that change is painful. But that's where I come back to leadership, particularly agency leadership, because it's very hard for the CIO, for him or her to do that themselves. They need the support of the agency leadership to say, this is really important to us. We need to get to a better place. It's going to take a couple years, but let's go on that journey together.
And one of the artifacts of the culture is the policies and the regulations in place. So in DoD, a lot of times, for DTS example, there's the joint travel regulations that were written for specific reasons in time that may or may not apply. We have to change the policy and the regulations to make sure that we're fielding a system that is getting to the future that we want, not just improving the car. And so that's what we're looking at. So one of the steps on our DTS pilot is we went into the JTRs and we said, okay, what needs to be rewritten here? And try to fast track that policy, not the normal 2-year revision cycle. That's usually the roadblocks, is the policy has to apply with the governance structure for the system you're trying to field, and that's where you can lose a lot of time.
So another focus of the executive order is on shared services, as you were talking about. Are there security concerns in shared services? What makes shared services so difficult?
Well, there's always security concerns, but I would argue that, again, if you're going to a shared service model, and I'm now a huge believer, again, I said it earlier, I'll repeat it, it would seem to me we should be looking for industry to come up with the shared service offerings at this point, rather than government agencies trying to do it themselves and then offer it to others. The world has moved rapidly. I mean, I remember when Vivek Kundra came out with his cloud first policy. I was a supporter of it, but back then you actually did have really legitimate arguments that said, hey, how do I know I have no way to monitor this. I have no idea what kind of security I'm getting out of this. This was 6, 7, 8 years ago, right? And today, I would argue that almost all, certainly I wouldn't say DoD, and I won't talk about classified systems here, but in the unclassed world for civilian agencies, most of them would be much better off to move to a completely outsourced cloud-based model from a security perspective. So I think that whole argument goes away. when it comes to shared services and security in today's world, which is a really positive thing for agencies. And you're starting to see a lot more movement that way, and I think that's very good. But it's directly to your point, Joe, that the question, I think it comes back to culture. Organizations have been running their own systems a long time. They like them. They do their own change orders. They don't have to compete with others, and they like that. And to get them to move to another model where all of a sudden they're just another tenant, so to speak, and and their requests are going to be lined up with everybody else's, and then there's some prioritization that's going to happen. A lot of them don't like that.
So let's take questions from the audience. You were enthusiastic before. Yes. Just 1 second, there's going to be a microphone.
That's fine. So it's really nice to hear. Thank you for taking my question. As far as modernization, innovation is a great word. I love it. But my question to you, Justin, is that are they talking about the role of a CISO? Cybersecurity and security is very critical. But having that role under CIO can sometimes create conflicts. So in this innovation entity that has been created, is there talk about moving that role where it's more connected to the stakeholders and really the CISO can speak freely and do what needs to be done, because a lot of times it's time versus repetition versus do we really need to tell the world what is happening? Because part of our problems today is a lot has been ignored or sidetracked.
You're talking about agency CISOs, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
That's what where is the CISO role going to be? Because if you're talking about modernization, I would like to see that role, because that's what the private sector is talking. The CISO role has sort of flunked right under the CIO. So has there been some talk?
Right. So I can't speak as much for obviously the Office of American Innovation, which has been heavily focused on this modernization innovation piece. But I know that my boss has been looking into this. This is an issue that's come up multiple times. Our MGT, the bill itself doesn't delve into that level of depth when it comes to the structure or that agency reporting structure, whether it's CISO to CIO to agency head or CISO in tandem with CIO. It doesn't go into that level of depth, but I think that's definitely an issue that folks, at least on the Hill, are talking about and looking at. Yeah.
Thank you.
And we don't have a federal CISO at this point.
Right.
Which,
Right. So, sorry. One more thing that I was thinking. I forgot briefly. It's part of the problem as well. Is that across the federal government, I think we're still struggling to implement some basic levels of cyber hygiene. The Data Act, for example, that was put into place 2 or 3 years ago. Before that, we weren't able to keep track of the data of how many pencils we're buying across agencies. So I think step by step is also important when it comes to that discussion.
right there. Anyone can.
Could you speak a little bit to where you see the future or the role the federal government will play in helping state and local municipalities protect critical infrastructure, specifically that rely on scholar systems? Will it be an active role that they play, or will it be more best practices, guidelines, and letting the local municipalities stand up their own systems to protect their own the state infrastructure or at the city level?
Okay, I'll take that from the DoD. DoD, we line up under DHS and similar support as we do for other supports for civil DISCA support, defense support to civil authorities. And that's kind of how we're aligned right now as far as that. So in the future, how we see that evolving, I think as we look at our National Guard relationships, I see that evolving in some ways, but that's still very nascent right now, how that's going to be. But DHS has the lead with us in support, and they would call upon the U.S. Department of Defense support as they needed if we were under some sort of SCADA attack that you referred to.
Richard, did you do some of the outreach to critical infrastructure when you were at DHS?
Yeah, I wasn't part of NPPD, of course. I was focused on our internal IT, although I certainly coordinated a lot with them, including with some state and local jurisdictions. I would just say that it's a bit of a political question in some degree, right, as to what should the authorities be of DHS when it comes to infrastructure that outside of its control. You were asking specifically about state and local governments. I would say that one thing I've been pleased about with DHS and the way they're handling this, they do an awful lot of work, okay, with critical infrastructure, including state and local government, and they're really there to help. So they may not have authorities in all these areas, but they certainly, if someone's under attack or if there are issues, they will put SWAT teams in there. They'll get support from DOD. They'll put together teams that help organizations, particularly in the local governments and in the critical infrastructure realm.
Yeah, the expansion of critical infrastructure to include voting infrastructure at the end of the Obama administration obviously was a very politically divisive moment between the federal and state and local governments. Other questions? One right there.
So this is for you, General.
I think we might get a
But
mic
other
to
people
you.
can respond. So my observation is that we're sort of being attacked by nation states, and we're being attacked by organized crime. And when we were attacked by Japan, within 6 months we were fighting back in Midway and taking the war against the Japanese. But it seems to me in cyber we're in a defensive crouch. And if we fought the war in the Second World War the way we're fighting cyber, we would be hardening our infrastructure, we'd be improving our reporting when the Japanese attacked us, we'd be having audits of that, but we wouldn't be attacking the Japanese. So why aren't we going after cybercrime and particularly after nation states that are attacking us?
And this might be our last question, so it's time for a great Churchillian speech, I think.
I can't promise. When I saw this in the Shakespeare Theater, I was a little worried that I was at the wrong place.
Henry V is fine, too.
Roger. I can't really talk to the why. That's a policy question. That's not my lane. But what I can talk to you about what we are doing to posture ourselves. And there are some parallels to your metaphor, but for the large part, they're not one for one. And so what we are doing is looking at U.S. Cyber Command elevation to a full combatant command. So they are more better postured and with the resourcing and the seat at the table that a full combatant command gets rather than a subunified. And so we're in the process of working through that and working that through the Secretary to the President for final certification and elevation of U.S. Cyber Command. So that's one of the things that will get at and better posture us for that. The other part, too, is producing the capabilities. The department with the joint staff and the services are fielding the cyber mission forces to better posture ourselves and to be ready, and working with the combatant commands to make sure that we're ready to do those sorts of activities that we're talking about. But the real crux of your question is a policy question. It's really an NSC question about how do we want to respond to this in this domain in attacks that cross over whole of government in ways that we haven't seen before, and really thinking through the nuances of how do we respond to that in a condition that is not full. We wouldn't say full war as a Pearl Harbor attack, but it's definitely not peace. So where are we in this kind of gray area? And
They're practicing in Ukraine now. What's happening in Ukraine is practice.
right, there's a lot of interesting parallels between the interwar period of World War I and World War II. And as I was preparing for this, I looked at his speech, and General Hap Arnold had a speech talking about he saw in the future of constructed robots or elements, and I'm getting this paraphrased, of mass warfare under wraps, which we wouldn't see, and then when robots would come across our shore with low or no warning. Well, it seems pretty prescient to what the situation is that we are in now, in that kind of similar situation. So largely a policy question, but from the department perspective, we are posturing ourselves to be able to respond when the nation needs us.
Richard or Austin, you guys want to delve into policy for a second?
No, I'm going to pass, but thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to pass on that too.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for joining all day.